Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about the ideal control setup for The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. Is it better to play with motion controls, or is it better to play with button controls? And let's say you go with button controls, what's the ideal way to play with button controls? What sort of variations lead to the best experience? We're going to be comparing the different control setups and coming to a conclusion in terms of what is the best way to play Skyward Sword HD. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. Before we talk about what is the best of the two, motion controls or button controls to experience the game, let's first talk about the variations of controls for both motion and buttons. Now when it comes to motion controls, there isn't really too much to sort of figure out here. Basically, you have your camera speed, which I would recommend to be very fast, regardless of which control option you're using. Being able to move the camera more quickly just makes sense, and very fast isn't really very fast. It still moves around at a comfortable pace. It's just not slow paced. It's an appropriate pace, I would say. So I really feel like very fast is just the right camera control speed for all different control setups for Skyward Sword. But going beyond that, there's also the option to invert the camera vertically or horizontally. Honestly, I mean, if you want to try that, go for it, but I think the default controls for motion work perfectly fine, and there really are no issues with that. But then for button-only controls, I think it's a little different. So firstly, I do keep the motion controls on for aiming. It actually works pretty well. So the motion controls aren't that extensive when it comes to the aiming. It just sort of assists a little bit, speeds it up a little bit. Kind of like Splatoon. It really helps with that vertical aiming a little bit, where you can still move around more accurately from a horizontal perspective with the control stick. Using both the motion controls with the control stick together for aiming around actually feels really nice. It's similar to how it worked in Breath of the Wild, and I felt like that worked out perfectly. But motion controls for the camera, I'm gonna have to give it a hard no. Now I understand there's definitely some sort of debate about how the free camera works in Skyward Sword HD, because you have to hold the left bumper to actually use it with the actual right control stick, because when you're not using the left bumper, the right control stick uses the sword. So we'll be getting to that in a little bit, but I tried out using maybe the motion controls in conjunction with the standard control stick options, but it honestly just didn't really work out well for me. I didn't really like it too much. I think between being able to center the camera and using the L button control stick camera movement option, and plus also being able to center things with the Y button because there's some motion controls involved, those three different options together I think work out pretty well in terms of getting the camera controls done. Using the extra motion just kind of throws things off a little bit. It's not really necessary, and you can't really move things around to the same degree you could with the control stick. It just is a little cumbersome in my opinion, because you don't have as much free range of movement with motion, because your wrist can only go so far before it becomes kind of ridiculous, and when you use a control stick, you can get a lot more done a lot more easily. So in my opinion, I don't really think you need to use motion controls for the camera. But like I said earlier, for both motion and button controls, the camera speed should stick to very fast in my opinion. But when it comes to inverting the camera itself, I still think that should stay off. However, when it comes to flying and using the beetle and swimming around, I do recommend switching that to inverted. So when you first start playing Skyward Sword and you're playing with the button controls and you are in the sky trying to fly around, there's just something that feels a little off about the way it is when it's not inverted. It feels strange when you aim up to fly up, but then also press the A button to flap your wings to fly higher at the same time. There's something about it that just feels a little off. But when you invert the controls, all of a sudden it starts to make a lot more sense. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when you're in the air, you're not moving around in the same way, because you do have to move up and down, but forwards as well. So by inverting the controls, it feels a lot more like a plane, and then when you flap your wings, it sort of complements each other more easily, in my opinion. The inverted controls just feel right. And then going beyond that, one other sort of control option that I think is strongly recommended for both options is the screen display. Go to simple, it just makes the HUD a lot more clean. Now, if you need assistance with remembering some of the button options, then maybe don't use simple, use normal. But after a while, I recommend just going to simple, because you can see more of the screen that way, and you don't really need that extra little bit of information. But now let's start comparing button controls with motion controls. How do they compare? What are the best ways to sort of go about playing with them? So when it comes to motion, I'll say that it feels very intuitive. It's clear that the game was designed for motion. And with the Joy-Cons, thanks to the now right stick, because back on the Wiimote and Nunchuck on the Nintendo Wii, there wasn't a right stick, so you didn't have an option for free camera control. That's something new to Skyward Sword. But with the Joy-Cons and that right stick now available, you can move the camera around more freely, and that makes the game feel a lot nicer. It feels more like a proper 3D Zelda game, in my opinion, with that free camera control. It's just something we've come to expect from most third-person action-adventure games in general, and it's great because it gives you more options in terms of appreciating the world around you, seeing different important details, and just enjoying just how beautiful Skyward Sword is. So it just works really well with the Joy-Cons, and because the motions are attached to the Joy-Cons, you can move around your sword, and it's separate from the control stick, so you can still use the camera, so you don't have the same left bumper issue you do have with the button control. So because of that, the motion controls feel a lot more organic in my opinion, and yes, a lot of the puzzles and combat have been built around you using motions to attack everything, so it just kind of feels right. But at the same time, there are some little nitpicks I have. So for example, you kind of always have to recenter your camera when you're using the different motion control weapons and items. And it's not a big deal because all you have to do is press Y and it recenters very quickly, but every time you go ahead to try and aim around like with your slingshot and you have to do that, it's a little off-putting. It kind of takes away from your immersion just a little bit, and to me, that is a little annoying. But in terms of the standard controls, it all works fine. I think you can play through Skyward Sword HD pretty much entirely fine with the motion controls, and it'll be great. But I gotta say, while I do feel like with the motion controls, it definitely feels like the most intuitive, organic way to play Skyward Sword, in general, I don't like playing with motion controls for extended periods of time. Just flicking around your wrist repeatedly to do all the different attacks, me personally, can get a little tiring. And I do work out sometimes, and I use weights and things like that, so it's not like, you know, I'm not used to having some sort of physical activity, but at least for me personally, it can get a little cumbersome, a little taxing to be always flicking around my wrist to do the different sword attacks and such. So I guess I just don't like motion controls for extended periods of gameplay. And I do want to continue talking about that a little bit more when it comes to like swimming around, for example. I finally got to the swimming part in the game and I played around for a little bit to sort of see how it would play, because I have heard that a lot of people had issues with the swimming back on the Nintendo Wii, and myself, it was fine, but I do remember it being perhaps a little challenging to move around. I didn't have that much trouble this time around. I don't know if it got better or if I'm just remembering things incorrectly, but it felt fine. It felt fine the way the sword controls feel fine, but when I think about playing the game for an extended period of time, just moving my wrist around all the time gets kind of annoying. Now, I do feel like when you're flying around, it's a little bit more subtle, and it works out pretty well. I think it feels really good. The only awkward thing about flying around with the motion controls is that you don't really use your left controller at all during this time. But beyond that, it feels great. It feels very intuitive. It feels more intuitive than the button controls options. So I would say that if you're sort of looking forward to playing Skyward Sword but for shorter bouts, playing with motion controls is like the ideal way to play the game. If you want to get the ultimate experience of Skyward Sword with that sense of motion and attacking things and actually kind of feeling a little bit. Like, there is some of that too there, and that can be kind of exciting. But if you just want to sort of experience the game as a traditional game, then I do think button controls is the way to go. There are some things you kind of need to get used to. As I explained earlier, there were a few things I felt like needed to be changed for the game to feel correct. Inverting the actual flying and swimming and beetle controls I think was really important because it just didn't feel right beforehand. And to be clear, I'm not the kind of person that likes inverting controls. For me, I usually am pretty good with the default controls. I usually am entirely fine with it, but I felt like it was needed this time around. And once I switched over to the inversion, flying felt so much better. But the big thing that has taken some getting used to are the free camera controls. Now, the interesting thing about free camera controls is, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't a part of the initial game. The Nintendo Wii controller just didn't have a right stick, so you couldn't do it. But playing through Skyward Sword back in the day, back in 2011, it was something that I felt was strongly lacking. It's something that I always wanted, and the fact that it's now in Skyward Sword HD, I think that's a godsend. I think it's a very good thing to have, and I think it works really well with the motion controls. But with button controls, you have to press that left bumper, which isn't like most third-person action-adventure games. There are some, but most pretty much just work normally by just pressing the stick, and that's how we've been sort of trained to play games nowadays. So when you have to do it in a different way, it does seem a little weird, especially because you're going to be using the right stick a lot for your sword, and because you have to kind of switch between camera and sword attacks, it's not normal, it's not natural. It has taken some getting used to. Now, because Skyward Sword initially didn't even have a free camera, it's not something you actually really need at all to progress through the game. You could play through the entire game and never press the left bumper and you would be fine. That's how the game was back in the day, and the game was still pretty good. But I'll also tell you, as I've played through the game, I've learned to balance pressing left bumper to use the camera and time when I actually use my sword attacks, and then also I can still center my camera with ZL, and then occasionally, you know, I can sort of center things a little bit with the Y button. Using all those things in conjunction and finding that proper balance has taken a few hours of gameplay, but now that I'm about a third way through the game, or maybe 4/10 away through the game, I do feel like it works pretty well. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it's beyond serviceable, and I don't really feel like it's worth complaining about. It just takes a little while to get used to. But there's actually one other big thing that we still need to talk about when it comes to button controls, and that's the sword controls with the right stick. The reason we have to press the left bumper to control the camera is because the sword controls are mapped to the right stick. It's replacing the motion controls, which is how the game was designed initially back in 2011. So how well does it work? Well, it works, and it did take a while to get used to, but once I got used to it, I feel like it works pretty well. But again, it takes some getting used to, because when I first started playing the game, I realized something. The way you do your spin attacks, the horizontal spin attack and the vertical spin attack, by pressing left, right, left, or up, down, up. And the spin attacks work fine, they're fairly easy to do, but if you're trying to do standard swings, you're going to find yourself accidentally doing the spin attacks quite a bit. So what I sort of realized is that when you're using the sword controls, as opposed to keeping your thumb on the control stick when you're doing the different sword attacks, you actually have to be flicking the stick. So if you want to do just a standard diagonal swing or vertical swing or horizontal swing, you actually have to flick the stick in that direction and release. That way you won't accidentally do any of the spin attacks. If you think of your thumb when it hits the stick as an actual sword swipe, it works pretty well. You just have to continually release per swipe, that way you don't accidentally do the spin attacks. And when you do the spin attacks, well, you keep your thumb on the control stick and you do the left, right, left, or up, down, up. And they work consistently and really well. And then thrust is just with pressing the stick, which makes sense and also works pretty well, and that's all fine. Now there was one other thing that I noticed at first it also took a little while for me to sort of figure out, and that is the forward jump attack. So at first I thought you had to sort of lock onto your opponent as you normally would for any previous Zelda game, and then press forward and A to jump forward to do your jump forward attack. Except in Skyward Sword that just pushes you forward, and then you have to do a sword attack to actually do the forward jump attack. So I was under the impression at first that you had to flick your stick while you were in the air, and that felt a little weird to push forward, press A, and then quickly flick to the stick to actually do the jump attack, and that's not what you need to do. You can do that, but an easier way is simply by pressing A second time. If you press A a second time, you can do the jump attack and it works perfectly fine. It's faster and it's more intuitive, I would say, and it works out fine. But these aren't things the game tells you, which you could maybe argue is a fair criticism, but you could also say is a nice thing, because with Skyward Sword HD, Nintendo has done different things to sort of make the game feel less handholdy, a little bit more challenging and not too babying of the player. They've really slimmed down some of the tutorials to speed up the flow of the gameplay, and I think overall it's actually improved the game. But it has meant that with the button controls, There are some things to get used to, there are some things to tinker. Maybe they could have balanced that a little bit differently, but once you get used to it, I think it works really, really well, and I prefer to play the game with button controls. And I'm not trying to say that I think the motion controls are inferior to button controls here. When I play it, it feels the most natural and organic. But personally, I just don't like flicking around my wrist that much, rotating it around that much for extended periods of play. But for the button controls, once you get used to everything, it works fine and it's continually enjoyable for extended periods of play, and I don't feel any tiring to my joints or anything like that. I don't feel like I have to bend my wrist too much to accomplish a tight turn underwater or while flying around or anything of that nature. It just works fine, and I can just focus on enjoying the game, and it's easier for me to stay immersed through button controls. So if I'm playing for a short period of time, I might play with motion for a little bit. It works pretty well, it's pretty nice. But button controls, now that I've gotten used to things, I don't feel like I'm really losing out on anything. It's actually a little bit more easy for me to stay immersed with the game. So I side with button controls, but motion controls are still a good option. So those are my thoughts on the ideal control setup for The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. What do you guys think? Are you going to try some of the things I suggested in this video, or do you have a different way of playing the game? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.